Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. I'm hilary.Salt.
And I'm Sebastian.Moore.
And we are recording again in a sweltering Manchester.
Bloody boiling. This is the reason I'm in a t-shirt.
Yeah, and I've not put my jacket on. But we wanted to do a news episode this week, so we are going above and beyond to make sure we get something out.
But before we do, last week you thought that gerrymandering might be Irish, and then we realised that was because you were linking it to boycott, and we said we'd look it up for this week. So do you know where boycott comes from? Yes,
I did look up boycotts, and it is Irish. So this is in the 1880s. Captain Charles Boycott was the landlord for the then absentee landlord, Lord Erne. And do you remember I was at Lough Erne the other week when I was in Enniskillen? Right. So it's that area. And Boycott, who was the kind of land manager at the time, was putting up rents and being very strict with his tenants. And the tenants decided to kind of socially ostracise him. Would use those words now. And that's where the word boycott comes from.
Very good. And that is very fitting for our theme today, because we're going to be talking a little bit about housing. Mm-hmm. So if he was a landlord.
Exactly, yeah. An absentee landlord as well. There's a lot of that in the housing market, isn't there?
Exactly. So I would like to talk a little bit about the new towns that Labour have pledged to build.
Yes.
And where we're up to on that.
Okay.
And specifically about this idea of what they're going to look like and whether we can make them beautiful.
I'm sure we'd like to, yes.
And you're going to be talking about?
Council tax. So it may be a Labour policy heavy episode, but I want to talk about the Fair Funding Review, which is about the way in which council tax is, more the way in which the central government grant that tops up council tax is distributed across the country.
Amazing. Should we start with the council tax then?
Yes, shall I? Yes, go for that first. So the reason this is in the news is that we are currently in the middle of a consultation on this, but it closes, I think today, we're recording on Friday. And there has been quite a bit in the press from people who are concerned about what the outcome of this review might be. So shall I just give you a bit of background first, just so you understand the story? So there has been a lot of debate and discussion about the fact that the way in which council tax works can seem very unfair. So I think the one example that people use quite a lot is that the council tax on a 3-bedroomed house in Hartlepool is less than on a £10 million mansion in Westminster.
It's less?
Yes. Sorry, it's more than. Yeah. Sorry.
I presumed so.
Yeah, it's more than. Sorry. It wouldn't be unusual. It wouldn't be an unusual result, that would it? Yes. So the example that's usually used is that the council tax on a 3-bedroomed house in Hartlepool is more than on a 10-bedroom mansion in Westminster.
Is that true?
Yeah.
Why?
So there are some councils, particularly in London, who are very known for having very low council tax rates. And part of the reason for that is that they're able to levy very high business rates on, the big multinational businesses that are in their areas. So it does mean that they can use their different funding streams to keep council tax low in some areas, whereas, for Hartlepool to do that will be very, very tricky.
Yeah.
So the Fair Funding Review, which is the thing that government are doing, it tries to re-establish what is a fair way to spread out the kind of top-up that central government give to councils. And I think that's something like £70 billion. It's a lot of money. So thinking about, where councils raise their money, there's 3 main things. There's council tax on individual houses, there's business rates on businesses, and there's this top-up that they get from central government. And perhaps just to remind ourselves about what councils spend money on. They spend money on adult social care is the really big thing these days. Child social care. And then all the other things like roads and infrastructure and planning and everything else.
Bin collection,
yeah. But I think it's 40% adult social care, 20% child social care. So they're the really big things. I think education is separate. So that's what, that's the kind of income and outgo that a council has to manage. So what the government are trying to do, and I think it's right that they try to look for a better way of making sure that the central government grants are distributed fairly, is they're trying to kind of do the sum of saying how much does a council need and how much can they raise, and therefore how much do we need to subsidise them. So the first half of that question, how much do they need, is called, I think, a needs assessment or something like that. But there's, they've got their own terminology for all these things. As ever, it's TLA heavy, 3-letter acronym heavy, this whole area.
TLA, I like that.
Yeah.
3-letter acronym, TLA. That's funny.
So they do this needs assessment, which looks at both what are the needs in that area. So things like what's the level of homelessness, what's the level of special educational needs and all that kind of stuff. And what are the costs in that area? Because obviously the cost of providing a service might be very different in Carlisle to what it is in... I'm trying to think of somewhere down south beginning with a C and I can't think of anywhere. But Kettering, no, that's a K, isn't it? Oh, anyway. So it could be very different.
Oh, I can't think of a C.
I don't know. I
can think of lots of ch, like CH, but I need a C. K.
Yeah, people will be writing in about this definitely, won't they? Chichester. That's a ch, yeah. Cirencester.
It's still a S, isn't it? You need a K for it to work. K.
Yeah. Anyway, moving on. So, what government is doing is going through this assessment, kind of county by county or area by area, saying, what is this needs that each council has. And then what they do is they compare that to that council's ability to fundraise. So what they're doing is they're saying across the country, what is the kind of notional income that we could generate from council tax and business rates? So, if we had the kind of notional council tax was the same for everybody up and down the country, notional business rates is the same for everybody up and down the country.
When you say the same for everybody, that would be as a proportion of the value of the property?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, if you set that for each area, what's that area's ability to generate income? And then if you look at the difference between that, but it's on a notional basis, which is the same for everybody. It doesn't allow for the actual differences in council tax rates that people are currently charging. So if you look at those two things, you've then got an assessment of what that area needs, how much it can generate, and therefore how much top-up it might need from government. Now, so far sounds so sensible, doesn't it? And in some ways, I do think it is right that government is addressing this issue, that the split at the moment does look unfair. But there's a lot of press comments, particularly from people like, there's some of the London areas that are, and they are effectively saying this could mean a dramatic cut in the state subsidy that we get. And we don't know any numbers on this yet. The government is consulting on the methodology at the moment. It's not said this would mean X pounds for, here, there or anywhere. So some of the London boroughs, but also some of the people like the business lobby have been saying this could be really, really problematic for London because it could mean that there would be really significant increases in council tax rates. Now, you might know that if you want to raise your council tax rates by more than 5%, you have to get government agreement to do that. And some of the numbers that have been bandied around in the press is that some areas might need to raise council tax rates by 21%. So, really, really significant.
Yeah, just on what councils are allowed to do, that 5% that they're allowed to increase by of their own volition. I mean, I know that Manchester, for example, our council tax has just gone up by 5%, of course, because they're doing it as much as they're allowed. If they wanted to increase, I didn't know about this, if they wanted to increase it more than that, they are allowed to ask government for permission?
That's my understanding, yes. Okay. Yes. So I think I'm Trafford, not Manchester. You always get this confused.
Me? I don't.
When you said we, I'm
not
Manchester.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
I'm Trafford. So I think Trafford raised it by a little bit more than 5%, but they had to get government agreement to do that. That's potentially one of the outcomes. I mean, government has been trying to reassure people by saying things like this would be phased in. There would potentially be some additional support for those councils where it is a real problem. But, I guess until we know the numbers, we don't really see how any of this works. But I guess the points I would make are, first of all, that it does feel right that the current system affects people very differently and doesn't feel fair. And the other thing is that it always raises, again, the question of, should there be additional income streams that councils could generate money from? So this is discussed, by political hacks quite a lot, things like, should you be able to raise a local income tax? And obviously they can do that in Scotland. Two of the things that perhaps I wanted to mention, because they're things that we would support, one is an additional council tax on uninhabited properties. So, if you leave a house uninhabited for a long time, obviously what the council wants to do really is to make that house available for other people to live in. But if a way to do that, to encourage people to move a house that's not currently occupied on, then applying an additional a council tax would be a little push, a little nudge in the right direction, would generate some income, probably not a huge amount. But the other thing that might have a kind of segue into what you want to talk about is land tax. So we have always said that one of the problems of developing land is that when a piece of land gets planning permission, it massively rises in value. And all of the benefit of that flows at the moment to the person who owns the land, which is generally the developer. And if we were to be able to tax some of that uplift, that would generate additional income for a council, which would mean the council could use that to help so that the developer doesn't just develop houses, for example. The council can also use that additional tax to kind of placemake, to make sure that they're putting in GP surgeries and nurseries and so on and so forth. I didn't copy off you there, but yeah, I thought it might segue into what you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, let's just touch on that a little bit more, this land value tax. So you have a patch of land that a developer buys, they then get planning permission. And as soon as planning permission is granted, that patch of land goes from a very small worth to suddenly the value just skyrockets.
Correct.
Right? Now, at the moment, they can then sell that land on, and that is pure profit.
Correct.
And I think this land value tax is really interesting because it is a policy that has a lot of approval across the political spectrum. Yeah. It ties in quite nicely with Georgism, which is a very popular thing on the internet in dark areas of the internet. Not dark, but...
Have you been on Reddit again?
I'm not sure I go much on Reddit, but Henry George was an economist, and he had this idea of a land value tax, which is not too dissimilar to this. And what we're saying as a party, is the SDP, says, okay, you get planning permission on that land. The value goes from a very small amount, skyrockets. We just want to say 50% tax on that.
To the local authority, yes.
And a lot of, when people talk about tax, they say, when you tax something, you get less of it.
Mm-hmm. The Laffer curve.
The Laffer curve, there we go. But this is one where it's sort of a win-win, because a housing developer isn't going to say, oh, okay, well, I'm not going to ask for planning permission on this land, because they're still getting 50% of that profit.
Absolutely.
So I think it's a no-brainer. And I think the SDP is the only main party, at least, that is advocating for that.
Yes, yeah. And that was in our manifesto at the last election. So it's not a new thing, we're committed to it.
Yeah. all right, let's move on from the SDP propaganda that we're keen to espouse. But
it does segue quite nicely.
It does. It does very much so. Yeah. Can I talk about the new towns then?
Yes, please.
This is something that I find it difficult when one of the main two parties, certainly Labour or Conservatives, come out with something that I like, because I want to be positive, and I'm a big advocate, as you know, of admitting when the opposition says something that you like.
Yeah.
But I have this scepticism as well that's sort of, I suppose, been cultivated by years of mismanagement of the economy and mismanagement of our country from these two parties.
30 years of hurt, are you going to say?
Not quite. We're up to how many years of hurt now? 50 years of hurt?
60, I think, is it? 1966.
60?
Mm-hmm.
No, that's crazy. I remember 40 years of hurt when 2006 World Cup when I was a kid. Yeah. 60 years of hurt. Anyway.
I was thinking more of your being around about that age, so it's the 30 years of hurt.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I see. I am, turning 30 next year. Okay, let me get back on track. So the new towns, this was a policy that Labour had in its manifesto last year, that they were saying in order to build the houses we need, we're going to build these new towns. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a policy that, certainly in the UK, where we are a pretty densely populated country, there's still a lot of space out there. But there can be a great deal of opposition to building. And it's something that you and I talk about a lot, which is to say we need to build.
Yeah.
But people might have heard of the phrase NIMBY, which stands for not in my backyard. Mm-hmm. So we talk about NIMBYism, being rejecting this idea of building. I think new towns, and I would extend this to a city as well, to a new city, is a way of addressing some of those concerns. Because I think what a lot of people dislike is this idea of urban sprawl, which you take a big population centre like London and it just sprawls incessantly outwards. And especially if you live in one of these cities, the countryside gets further and further away from you, and it becomes much more unlivable, if I can say that. Interestingly, I was in a pub in Burnage, which is a part of Manchester. And on the wall in this pub, it's a great pub, The Sun in September. And on the wall, it had a quote from George Bernard Shaw, which said, "Burnage must surely be the prettiest village in Manchester." And I said to the people I was with who live in Burnage and have lived there for 50 years, I said, "Burnage isn't a village." And they said, "Well, of course it was at one point."
Yeah.
But the urban sprawl of Manchester has just turned Burnage into a very urban area, which is probably not as nice to live in now as it would have been back then. And so I'm a big fan of this idea of creating new places. And this links to what you were just talking about place building. So I wanted to give a little bit of an update on where we are with the new town stuff, because I think these things can easily kind of fly under the radar. So last September, the government set up a new towns task force, which sounds good, doesn't it?
Great.
Task force. Headed up by Sir Michael Lyons. And he gave an interim update in February to say the majority of the sites submitted were extensions to existing towns or cities with a smaller number of proposals for standalone settlements, which suddenly sort of deflates me a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's going from having these new towns. I mean, the task force itself is called the New Towns Task Force, but then the proposals that are being submitted are just for extending urban areas.
Yeah.
And of course, there's reasons why that's in many people's best interests, the developers and so on, because a lot of the infrastructure's there, drainage and sewage and things. So they think, we'll just tag on a couple more buildings there. Brilliant, it's quick profit. But it's none of this long-term planning for the future that we would like to see. So there's a guy called Nigel Hugill. This comes, by the way, from a Financial Times article that I saw this week. And it's talking about, this is really interesting, it's talking about how maybe the new towns that we're trying to build, we could look for inspiration. We could look for inspiration for these new towns towards medieval France.
Okay.
Which I think is a really interesting idea. And it quotes in the article, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. It quotes the chair of a think tank called Centre for Cities, Nigel Hugill, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who says housing isn't enough to make a town. I think that's something we've discussed loads.
Absolutely.
A lot of the problems that I think you have with the developments that have gone on in the last 30, 40 years is that they are just more and more houses, right? And then you end up at some point needing a shopping centre, further out of town. We've got in Manchester, we've got the Trafford Centre, which I think is just a monstrosity, I'm afraid. But that might be a controversial opinion because I know a lot of people like the Trafford Centre. Anyway, there's an interesting line in this article. It said, medieval feudal lords had more of a stake in ensuring their new towns were sustainable than most property developers today.
I agree with that.
Which is fascinating, isn't it? Because we think of those times as being very backward, and of course there are a lot of issues around that feudal system, but we haven't done enough to replicate that idea of having a stake in your local area and having a stake in making sure that it's a nice place to live in.
Yeah.
We had a meeting, a Northwest meeting for the SDP this week, which William Clouston was a guest speaker at, the SDP leader, and he talked on this idea of building beautiful. And there was a comment during the meeting about places like Port Sunlight, which I'd never heard of before. Do you know much about Port Sunlight?
Oh, yes, I've been to Port Sunlight.
Have you?
So it's the Lever
What's it
Brothers.
like?
It's beautiful. It's really beautiful. And there's like a little village green, and there's houses around it, and there's a little theatre. So, they'd built a theatre for people to attend.
And this was built
really
for the
nice.
workers of the Lever Brothers company.
Correct.
So Lever Brothers invested in this new village.
Yeah.
And I think they were soap manufacturers.
Yeah, Sunlight Soap is
Okay.
That's where the name comes from. Yeah.
Do you say that as if I should know Sunlight Soap?
Yeah, I kind of think it's a generational thing. Maybe you don't.
But they had more of a stake in what that looked like. They had a stake in the fact that their employees were somewhat content with where they lived and had a more meaningful life, so that they'd be keen to work. And it was an investment in all areas of people's lives. Nowadays we don't have that, and we've got these housing developers that, without being too negative, I think there are some nice developments going on around Greater Manchester, but there's also some pretty awful stuff. I'm not a big fan of these massive skyscrapers.
Agreed.
And what you find, and this is where, going back to the idea of democratic support for these things, is that actually something like those skyscrapers, they require an awful lot of land space, because of the space you need around the skyscrapers. And you don't actually get that much, what's the word?
Density.
That much density, or I was going to say occupancy in the buildings.
Yeah.
And so an organisation like Create Streets, which we've mentioned before, and I'd love to get someone from Create Streets on the podcast.
Yes.
They are big advocates of this idea of gentle density. So building 4 or 5 stories, places like Paris, I think, are a really good example of this. Beautiful buildings, 4 or 5 stories, so that if you're in one of those buildings, you can see the sky, for example. A friend said to me, she came around this week and said, "Oh, I love the fact that you can see the sky from your building." And I thought, "Oh, isn't that normal?" It's not, obviously, for a lot of people that live in these massive high rises. Sorry, I'm losing my track again a little bit, but so something like those big, huge towers, they don't benefit anybody. It's a lot of foreign investment that comes in from them.
Yep.
They're not for the locals. The locals don't like them. And the housing developers at the moment, to sort of throw the council a bone, and so that the council can at least sort of claim to the local population that they're getting something worthwhile, the developers say, "Oh, we'll build a school, and we'll put a shop in or something." But it's not in their interests to make sure that that's sustainable in the long run. And this is why we have to, the democratic accountability has to be with the politicians, and particularly the local politicians. I think this is an area, and to push an SDP policy again, something we call for is county housing corporations, so that if you are, you see the plans for a new development in your area, you know who you can go to if you're not happy about them. Yeah. Whereas at the moment, I think it's the developers that you'd have to complain to, whereas it should be the politicians. They're the ones that you vote for, and you can vote out if you don't like what they're doing. Agreed.
Yes. Yeah. I suppose the other thing just to kind of think about is, how do you, because it's okay saying you want people to have a long-term interest, but how do you make sure that people have that long-term interest? And I always think the way to make a business have a long-term interest in something is to make sure that it has a kind of annuity income, an annual income. stream that depends on that place succeeding long term. And at the moment, you find that, a developer develops something, builds something, walks away. And I think if you had much more of a connection between the people developing a place and the kind of long-term landlord of that place, who is obviously dependent on the long-term income stream, that would make people a bit more accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, something in the Financial Times article I loved was talking about these medieval French towns that were built, and everything would be centered around the market square.
The boulangerie.
The boulangerie. I'm obsessed with boulangeries. I remember as a kid, I'd be going through France with my parents and just asking them at every single little village, can we stop at the boulangerie? Because of course France has that. You can't go to a village in France, however small, even a tiny little hamlet, without there at least being a boulangerie.
Yeah.
And there will usually be, as well as a boulangerie, a patisserie, a charcuterie, and lots of other little... Sorry, boulangerie is a bakery, for anyone that doesn't know, I should say.
Yeah.
But there will be the amenities so that you can, most of the time, you can be spending your days trading and conducting your affairs within your little village or your little town and getting to know the people. I mean, we talk about the sort of the decline of the high trust society that we in the SDP are massive advocates of. Is what better way of enabling and facilitating a high trust society than creating villages and towns where people can socialize, can trade in, can speak to the people, the mayor or whoever it is. And it's in their best interest to make sure they have good relationships with their neighbours.
Yeah. Yes.
Just before I finish, I will say that I sort of got onto a slight point about the article talking about these market squares. And this is going back to the point of the feudal lords, that it was in their best interest that market square would be a bustling, I think, centre of activity and trading, and they still are. And this is what's really interesting when you look at those towns today. The original planners couldn't have known what they'd have been used for at this point, because they're used for things like florists and estate agents that you wouldn't have had in those times. I don't know, like technology shops.
Yeah.
But it's creating sustainable ways that they can then be used in the future. A lot of what we do now is not timeless. It's not planning long term. And just a plea that we can, and this is a William Clouston special, good design costs nothing. He likes to remind us.
Yeah.
And in his speech on Wednesday, he showed a couple of slides of because he was a town planner in the City of Westminster, and he showed certain areas where you've got gorgeous Victorian buildings on one side, and they've just put a complete monstrosity on the other side, and they haven't taken any care in matching the context of the local architecture. Yeah. And this sort of thing, it's not difficult. We can do it. But there are some obstacles, things like skills. Do our builders and tradesmen and so forth have the skills that it takes? And you actually credited Manchester City Council, didn't you?
I did, because I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, the upgrade and refurbishment of Manchester Town Hall. They have employed hundreds of apprentices to do things like rebuild the mosaic tiling on the floors, to redo the stonework. So they've been training people in traditional crafts and building skills. And I think the kind of joke is that as soon as Manchester Town Hall is finished, they'll all be going down to the House of Parliament.
Right.
To Westminster.
I liked a line on that William Clouston said on Wednesday. He said, because he's involved in the market square in his village and putting in plans to upgrade that and to turn it into a much more accessible place that people can use and can trade in and so forth. And he said, people talk about, who will benefit from it. And he said, no one can't benefit from this. And that's a massive thing that you and I talk about all the time. It's like, this should be in the national interest, in everybody's interest. Yeah. And when we talk about building beautiful, people, the current politicians, and I don't like to blame politicians, it's probably the system that has sort of got us here, but they will always say, oh, but it's too difficult. We don't have the skills for it. We don't have this. It's too hard to build beautiful. it's too difficult not to do these things, because what else are we going to do? You know, and what more do we want from the future, and certainly in the next 5, 10, 20 years, than a national project that we can get everybody behind and say, you know, to our young people, well, you don't have to go to university. There's some great skilled opportunities here that you can go in, like Manchester Town Hall, and learn a trade. Absolutely.
You were thinking of a kind of moonshot project like build a new cathedral, weren't you?
Absolutely, yeah. So something that we talked about this yesterday, didn't we? Mariana Mazzucato likes to mention this. She's an economist who wrote a book called The Value of Everything. But she says that when they were attempting to put a man on the moon in the 60s, there was a load of byproducts that came from that were not related particularly to the moon expedition. But whilst they were trying to invent certain things, they started inventing other things.
Yeah.
I don't have off the top of my head, I can't think of a few examples, but so many inventions came from that period, because once you have a singular goal that everybody gets behind, you start to create really good stuff. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, why don't we try and build a cathedral? I mean, the last traditional cathedral that was built in this country was in 1870 in Truro. Why don't we try and build a cathedral and have a goal that we can all sort of harness? Harness?
Yeah, get behind. Yeah.
Get behind.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Non-stick pans, I think, were one of the things that came from...
There you go.
Putting
Non-stick pans.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's really... I think those two items that did have a bit of overlap, but hopefully were distinct enough to be of interest. Thank you for watching. We will see you again next week.
Or listening. I do have a slight apology to make, because last week it was very visual heavy. I had a lot of graphs and things, and I meant to say apologies for anybody that listens to us on Spotify or Apple Music or anything, because I know we have a lot of listeners that prefer to have us on whilst they're cooking or doing the ironing.
Yeah.
So apologies if you missed out on some of the visual aids.
Yeah, we've gone without the visual aids this week.
But feel free to email us and shout at us or leave a comment below the video. Yeah,
great. Thanks for listening. Please don't forget to subscribe, like the podcast, recommend it to your friends, give us 5-star reviews, and we'll see you again next week.
Cheers.